Welcome to the APH webinar, and Paul, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thank you everybody. My name is Paul Ferrara, and first of all, I got to give a special welcome out to Delaware. That's my home state, so big welcome, Delaware. Thanks for joining us. This is, as we know by now, the TMAP Building Environmental Literacy at a Distance webinar. Thank you for attending today. Let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. So first of all, of course, we're going to be talking about some APH solutions briefly, things that will help you with tactile graphics and map making. We'll go through our objectives. We'll let the TMAP presenters, who I'll introduce in a moment, talk to you about the product and how it works. We'll do questions and wrap up. Please make sure you put your questions in the chat. This is an hour-and-a-half long webinar, so we'll be here until 1:30 Eastern. So let's talk about some solutions from APH. The TactPlus Printer. It does print 3D images, tactile maps, STEM graphics. We'll do Braille as well. It uses a special capsule paper, so you do need a special type of paper for it. The printer paper bundle, easy for me to say, and the printer is $3,700. This is not a quota product. If you have questions, if you want samples from the printer, you can email sales@aph.org or call our 800 number, 800-223-1839. We also have a couple of new embossers that are coming out here shortly. The PixBlaster is one of them. It will retail at $3,995. It's quota eligible. It's a partnership with V+. See a picture of that there on the screen. And then, of course, our Page Blaster, which is a partnership with Humanware. Same price, $3,995. It is also quota eligible. Look for more information on those coming soon. And let's introduce our guests first now. We have 4 of them today. Greg Kehret, with the LightHouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired from San Francisco. Director, Media and Accessible Design Lab. They call it the MAD Lab. We have Jennifer Huey, also from the LightHouse, Certified Orientation and Mobility Specialist. Sarah McIntyre, also from the LightHouse, also a Certified Orientation and Mobility Specialist. And finally, Steve Lowry. He's with the Washington State School for the Blind. He's a teacher of the visually impaired. And let's get to our objectives, what we plan to do here today. So the participant will examine the history and development of TMAP software. The participant will review the 6 steps to create a TMAP street map. The participant will list 3 uses of TMAP in O&M instruction. The participant will identify at least 3 strategies to teach map reading readiness skills. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg. So take it away, Greg.
Okay, I am unmuted, I take it. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today and to be reaching such a wide audience. The last couple presentations I gave in recent months, pretty much the western regional part of the states, so this is fun. We have a very full agenda today. I'm going to introduce you to TMAP, what it is, the web app, the tactile map, how to get it, and then we're going to hear some orientation and mobility perspectives around TMAP. Jennifer will be talking about when to use it, the rewards of using, the challenges of using, adjusting your expectations, adult learning, tactile readiness skills, no right or wrong time to introduce TMAP, tips and tricks for decluttering your maps, and Sarah will be sharing a couple of case studies, work she's done with students. And then Steve has some O&M TMAP readiness skills, so prerequisites as well as TMAP activities. Next slide, please. So what it is, TMAP, writ all caps, is an acronym for Tactile Maps Automated Production. Dr. Josh Mealy, while a researcher at the Smith Kettlewell Eye Research Institute in San Francisco, developed TMAP and partnered with the LightHouse in San Francisco for production and distribution of maps. TMAP is a web-based app. That means it runs in your browser. It quickly creates tactile street maps for wayfinding and orientation. These maps are at the scale of a neighborhood, so anywhere from a few blocks to a few miles. Map creation is automated, so you determine the address, you select which features to include, the zoom level, the paper size, but you don't have to design it or make it from scratch. All the best practices for good tactile design have been built into the software. So maintaining standardized layout, spacing between tactile elements, line heights and widths, braille labeling, all is automated. And finally, PDF files are downloaded for local printing and embossing or delivered via email to anyone who can produce tactile graphics. Next slide. So why TMAP? Well, because tactile maps empower blind and low vision communities to navigate their neighborhoods, yet blind and visually impaired communities have little to no access to information that help them learn about their surroundings. For those with low or no sight, access to information about the streets around their homes, offices, schools is extremely useful. A methodology that's proven helpful is hard copy braille maps. The mental mapping that occurs from studying a map, one's spatial understanding of a place, is roughly equivalent to if one had physically explored that space. Historically, braille maps have been difficult to design, manufacture, and get into the hands of the thousands of people who want them. I'll add, there is an exigency now among teachers and students around distance learning. We seem to be in for the long haul. O&M specialists are finding TMAP to be an effective tool during shelter in place for teaching spatial development, routes, and developing tactile readiness skills. And that's what our O&M presenters will be talking about today. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the web app itself. So this is the user interface to create the maps. The main web pages are search, create map, and the file preview download page. So I'll go through a series of screenshots now and talk about each page in detail. Next slide. This is a screenshot of the TMAP landing page, tmap.lighthouse-sf.org. It's screen reader friendly, it's very simple. Its main function is a search box. So the placeholder reads, where are you traveling? So just search for a location by address, intersection, place name. You can even copy paste longitude and latitude coordinates in there. Yeah, just search for the location and click the search button. So for our examples that follow, type in American Printing House for the Blind, hit enter, and you advance to the Create Map page. And the next slide. So the main elements of this page are search, the bar and button, the address, which equals the map title, create map, that's a button, features, which are checkboxes, The viewer, this is the map box viewer. In this example, the address or the search term American Printing House, it's been converted into a street address, 1839 Frankfurt Avenue. And this corresponds to a locator dot at the epicenter of the map that will appear as a raised dot on the tactile map. Also on this page are features to include on your map. So streets, paths, service roads, railways. I'll mention that TMAP uses OpenStreetMap data to build maps. So OpenStreetMap is open source. Sometimes data contributed there is a little bit uneven in how it's tagged, or sometimes there's missing data. So it's possible that you would select a feature, let's say pedestrian paths, and then your map doesn't show that, even if you know in reality, no, there really are bike paths, you know, around this lake. It could just be that that data is not in OpenStreetMap. So that's just a caveat. There are some combo boxes here as well for paper type, zoom, and distance units. So, oops, I'm sorry, I scrolled past my note. Here we go. So you select the paper size, 11.5 inches by 11, common braille paper size. That is the default, but you can choose letter size, you can choose tabloid, portrait or landscape orientation. The zoom level, or we might think of it as map scale, but it's labeled as zoom. 1 to 5,000 is the default, but you can choose 1 to 1,500, 1 to 2,500, 1 to 12,500, 1 to 25,000, 1 to 50,000. So on an 11-inch square paper, these correspond roughly anywhere from a city block up to about 2.5 mile wide maps. Distance units, feet or meters, take your pick. This will appear as a scale line on the tactile map itself. And now we have this map box viewer. So this map, it looks like a map. This is designed to resemble the actual tactile map. It only shows those things we are getting from OpenStreetMap. So it's greatly simplified. It has the ability to pan and zoom. By default, maps center on the address, but you now have the ability to pan, so that lets you move the focus, and that can be very useful when trying to encompass a very specific area for your map. The Mapbox viewer is not fully accessible to screen readers, meaning it doesn't provide feedback. So screen reader users have to download and emboss the map to know exactly what they're getting. And finally, the Create Map button. So once you've made your selections, features, paper size, zoom, clicking Create Map advances us to the download page. Next slide, please. So the main elements, again, search bar and button, the address title, download and email buttons, and a visual file preview. So this differs from the previous view. The visual preview shows the image of the actual map file to be printed embossed. So here you are looking at the actual artwork. I will provide a description of the map on the slide because it's very instructive. So this map features streets, pedestrian paths, and service roads. In the upper left of the map, the address appears as the title, 1839 Frankfurt Ave. This address corresponds to a locator dot in the epicenter of the map. The upper right, the scale is shown. So there's a little line, and approximately 2 inches equals 50 feet. That's also corresponds to 1 to 1,500. Also in the upper right is a compass rose pointing north. Now around the perimeter Anywhere a street meets the margins are labels of street names. So I can see State, Frankfurt, Stoll. Note what appears to be a street that does not have a label. This is the driveway or parking lot for APH. It falls into the category of service roads, and service roads don't get street name labels, oftentimes because they don't have names. And we've a smattering of pedestrian paths. Each TMAP consists of a map and a key. So the download or email buttons result in a zip file that contains PDF and SVG files of tactile map, the corresponding visual map, a tactile key, and the corresponding visual key. Tactile maps printed at the LightHouse are visual and tactile. Now we realize that not everyone has the ability to render visual plus tactile. So depending on your production method, your mileage may vary. So if using a View Plus embosser, a Columbia, a Delta, we could even mention the PixBlaster, that's basically the same thing under the hood. You will generally get tactile only with Braille. If using a Swell machine, you could opt for tactile plus text or tactile plus Braille. Generally at the LightHouse, we use the PDF files. Clicking the download button is how we get our files. And in a moment, I'll show you what these look like, but first, recap. Next slide. So TMAP tactile maps are comprised of a map and a key, the elements that make up the map. The title, which equals the address, the locator dot, this raised circle marks the map address. The scale, a raised line, represents the distance unit. The north arrow. Streets are shown as raised lines. Service roads have a thinner stroke width. Pedestrian paths are a short dashed line. Railways are a long dash. And labels, of course. Street labels are confined to the margins and abbreviated because of space limitations. And we don't drop labels in the middle of the map because it introduces clutter that interferes with reading the raised lines. And then we have the key. Again, the title paired with the locator dot symbol. You'll see symbols, lines, and textures used on the map, followed by abbreviations. So street labels are limited to 5 Braille characters. So these abbreviations appear in the key, followed by the full written street name. Braille on the map and key are uncontracted, grade 1, Unified English Braille. The key also contains, of course, the full names of streets, and street orientation is also included. So whether the street runs east to west, north to south, and an introduction page. Now, this is not part of the map download. It's not in the zip file, but we do offer an introduction to TMAP page to help new users orient themselves to their maps. This is available along with a lot of other resources at lighthouse-sf.org/TMAP. Let's very quickly check out some screenshots of the map files themselves. So these next 4 images are all the same address. This is PDF page 1. It's the tactile map with Braille. This is what you'd get if you embossed. All the aforementioned are present: the map title, scale, compass rose, labels for streets, locator dot. Next slide. PDF page 2. This is the equivalent, the visual map with text. And next slide. PDF page 3 is the tactile key with Braille. So, as I mentioned, each map is generated with a key that shows the symbols, line types, list of streets. And finally, the next slide, PDF forward, the visual key, the equivalent. Next slide. So here's that same address, but at 1 to 5,000 scale. So now that approximately 2-inch line equals 250 feet. So now we get several square blocks. In our own practice, we usually give people 2 or more scales or versions of the same address. So a streets only overview gives the big picture, while zooming in, including additional features, provides a more detailed view. This scaffolding of information helps as no one map page is overly cluttered, and people can build their understanding of a location by going from simple to complex. Clutter is the enemy of tactile, so apply features judiciously. It depends on the density of the area, urban versus suburban versus rural, but generally we only include features on the lower map scales, so 1,500, 2,500, sometimes 5,000. Oops, I clicked on something, and next slide, please. Okay, TMAP distribution, how to get it. This is perhaps the most important slide in the deck. You can acquire a free user account to create, download, and emboss TMAPs yourself. So to request a user account, you will email us at the Lighthouse, tmap@lighthouse-sf.org. So again, TMAP@lighthouse-sf, as in San Francisco.org. This is a good option if you have access to or know someone who has access to a graphics embosser or Swell machine. Now, not everyone does have access to tactile graphics production tools, so for that reason, adaptations.org. TMAP tactile maps can be purchased retail through Adaptations, the Lighthouse store. The cost is $25 per packet. You will receive 2 maps of the same address, a zoomed out overview map and a zoomed in detailed map showing streets, paths, etc. A tactile map key, the introductory page. All materials are printed on 11.5 by 11 sheets of embossed paper and include ink print, large print, as well as Braille. Customization and bulk orders. I'm thinking of campus maps, maps of schools. So buildings, building labels, perhaps bus stops, perhaps different paper sizes. If that is something that's useful to you, a map that TMAP can't quite make right out of the box, then you can contact us at tmap@lighthouse-sf.org, and we can make that happen for you. Resources for educators. This isn't on the slide, but I'm going to mention it. lighthouse-sf.org/TMAP. We have an FAQ. There you'll find step-by-step instructions for how to use TMAP to make maps, details related to printing, lesson plans, as well as recent presentations and related blog posts and the like. So before we move on to hear from our O&M presenters, I will take questions from the audience.
All right. Greg, we couple questions. Can you add features that are not already included on the map?
So this gets a little into customization. Jennifer has a few things to say about that. We have a very limited palette in TMAP, those features that I mentioned. Part of the reason is you can add as many features as OpenStreetMap possesses, but that gets into dozens and hundreds of things tagged in different ways. And we wanted a user interface that was very simple. And we're also trying to walk that balance between giving an accurate map and giving a map that's legible. So the best way is usually to design the map as TMAP lets you, and then when you print it, you have some options for further customizing it on your own, whether it's adding bump dots or doing stuff with Swell paper, erasing lines, drawing lines. Jennifer will talk a bit more about that.
Can you tile the pages?
You can tile pages. There's not a function in TMAP that makes it very easy to do that seamlessly. And map, the artwork doesn't go edge to edge. There's always a margin because of printers. There's always at least a ½ inch margin. So you can tile, but you're not going to get a seamless tile. It's on the blue sky list of a thing that we would like to introduce. That would probably work better with 3D printed files, because then you could print all the way to the edge and tile things seamlessly.
I had a question about how this works in a rural environment.
In a rural environment, well, two things. OpenStreetMap tends to have more data entered for urban environments. By the way, Canada is extremely thoroughly well mapped in OpenStreetMap. So if you're in Canada, you're super stoked about this. Rural areas less so, but TMAP is primarily streets, roads, service roads. These things will show up. You will typically, because of it's less dense in rural areas, you'll find yourself using those higher scales, like 1 to 25,000, 1 to 50,000. And you won't necessarily find information. Well, it depends. You'll probably find railways and things like that. Play around with it. Check it out. See what results you get.
There are several more questions. Do we have any time for more questions, or should we move on to Jennifer?
I think we should give Jennifer her shot because she actually has a hard stop.
Okay, that's fine. Don't forget, we will definitely be getting these questions out and getting everybody answers to their questions. So please keep adding your questions. All right, let's turn it over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Greg. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and for some of you who might even be watching this on YouTube later, maybe even good evening to all of you. Welcome to our presentation. My name is Jennifer Huey. I am a certified orientation and mobility specialist with the LightHouse for the Blind. And over the next few minutes, I'd like to share and provide general overview of how O&M specialists can use TMAPs with their students. I'll also share a few tips and tricks, as Greg had mentioned, that I've learned along the way for a customized TMAP experience. So Greg talked about what TMAP is. As O&M specialists, when can we use TMAPs? And there are many opportunities. The first is orientation to neighborhoods or campus. Learn new routes. So this can be to or from home, or to and from point A to point B. Reinforce an existing known route. Reinforcement comes in many guises. Examples include confirming the length or shape of the route forwards and backwards, verifying street names, discussing intersection analysis, and explaining safe timings to cross. Expand existing routes. Adding a destination like a favorite coffee house between point A and point B effectively creates a multi-point route for your student. This becomes point A to point B to point C. Create new routes. Students can create new routes as a result of their existing knowledge, experience, and success. Understand street patterns and design. This is grid pattern versus nonlinear versus campus, the urban areas versus rural. Fill in mental blanks. Have you ever heard your student say, "I just don't understand what's going on here"? Your student may need support in areas that may not make sense to them, or they may have an incomplete mental image of the environment. Using a TMAP can help bridge the gaps. Reinforce students' understanding of environment. How? Engage and cultivate their curiosity, expand on their existing knowledge, and encourage exploration. Boost mapping skills. Students learn compass, cardinal directions, and how to use them correctly. Directionality and spatial orientation. Using tactile maps such as TMAPs can help students gain a broader perspective of the environment around them. Next slide, please. Thank you. There are many rewards to using TMAPs with your student. First and foremost, it stimulates tactile literacy. Students learn the language of lines, and that's really exciting. It can promote environmental literacy. Students gather more information about their environment, how their neighborhood block may be laid out, street design, location of freeways in relationship to their home or workplace, etc. It can also enhance spatial awareness. Students learn students learn to feel how streets and paths intersect, name compass and cardinal directions, identify and track the specific shape of a route forwards and backwards, understand self-to-object relationships and object-to-object relationships. Next slide, please. Bumps in the road. So there are several challenge areas to be mindful of when using TMAPs. The first is student mindset. Some students have existing mindsets that affect their learning potential. Examples are statements such as, "I'm not a map person," or "I'm bad with directions." The need for simplification. Greg alluded to this a little bit earlier when he mentioned cluttering. So customizing TMAPs to your students' goals is important. Consequently, time may be needed to remove distracting or confusing lines, extraneous buildings that can overwhelm your student. And I'll share about that in a little bit. The need for tactile readiness skills. If there's one area that I'd like to stress for student success, it's tactile readiness. Prep your students for success. Consider having multiple lessons with the TMAP to include items such as time to teach your student how to track lines that intersect and curve, how to successfully discriminate different types of lines, and identify the various components that make up the map key. Take as much time as needed in this area before introducing TMAP to your student. And understanding lines. What I mean by this is that TMAP lines represent the street or road. Our students should understand that they would be walking on either side of it. Next slide, please. Adjusting your expectations as an instructor will significantly impact the level of success you will experience with your student. Different students will gain different insights from TMAP. Each individual we serve, as we know, is uniquely wired, process information differently, and will have unique experiences with TMAP at that moment in time. For some, it could reinforce their mental understanding of the relationship between streets that run north-south and west-east. For others, being able to remain oriented while tracking streets that curve or bend is a major milestone. And of course, for some, it's successfully physically navigating a route independently because of their work with TMAP. Every student will need varying degrees of support, from students who are Braille readers to students who do not read Braille. The investment of prep work is critical for setting up our students for success. Not every student may show interest, and I suggest that you try with your student, and if you can, gently probe deeper as to why they may not be interested. You may be able to introduce an aspect of mapping that may be of value to them, such as seeing how far that favorite cafe may be from their home, or finally understanding compass directions. All students will benefit. Sarah's case studies will demonstrate this. Next slide, please. LightHouse for the Blind serves primarily adults, so just a little bit of information about adult learning model. Respect individual learning styles. No two lessons are the same. Many adult students already understand basic map concepts. This is particularly true of individuals who have low vision or adventitious vision loss. Many may have a working knowledge of left-right, basic compass directions, neighborhood layout, familiarity with environment, and how street names are positioned in relationship to its street on the map. Students' background and life experiences are valuable. Our students have wonderfully varied backgrounds, very interesting stories, and unique life experiences. So a TMAP can be centered around their area of interest as well. Next slide, please. There are multiple tactile readiness skills emphasized for all learners of all age brackets, and these are just a few. Compass directions, north is naturally oriented at the top of TMAPs. Systematic search and scan patterns. This is a skill that is continually utilized with TMAPs. A top-bottom, left-right pattern may be used to introduce the student to the map, or perhaps for an advanced student or the student with low vision, you can start with the locator dot in the center of the map and work outwards in a systematic fashion. Whatever is best suited for your student, a systematic search and scan pattern will enhance map reading efficiency. Tracking, this is the ability to follow a line from one end to the other without their finger trailing off. One goal could be to remain oriented while encountering multiple intersections and reverse directions. Tactile discrimination. This is the ability to recognize the differences between a solid line, a dashed line, the locator dot, and objects that represent buildings. Next slide, please. Not one way. So what does this mean? Teaching is fluid. There is no right or wrong time to introduce TMAPs. Focus on your students' unique capacity for learning at that moment. You may even find yourself introducing TMAPs at a certain point in their program, putting it aside to say, let's say, explore other planning methods and come back to it later. And that's okay. TMAP can also reinforce a route before or after physically navigating it. TMAPs can also be used as a means of developing new routes and exploring an environment. Encourage exploration and curiosity. As instructors, I know that we all do. Problem solving and spatial awareness skills. Sarah's case studies will demonstrate these ideas. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, but last but not least, a few tips and tricks for customization when printing your TMAPs on Swell or capsule paper. And this is what we've learned along the way. Writing instruments. So you can use a Swell marker, a black Sharpie, Uniball gel pens too. I've tried the Vision Elite and Impact RT. These are used to accentuate lines or a main street, draw buildings, make X's, whatever may suit your students' needs or preferences. And just a quick note here, the Swell machine's heat settings may need to be adjusted, or the paper may need to be run several times through the machine at incrementally higher heat levels to achieve a sufficient rise. Correction tape or correction fluid. Now these items can be used to remove unwanted or extraneous information that may confuse or overwhelm your student. Both the correction tape or fluid and marker should be used directly on the Swell paper before it's heated. Bump dots. As we know, these come in a variety of sizes and shapes and colors. These are used to target a specific location or item on the map, something you may want to focus on. PDF editors. Now these allow users to edit, add, or modify text and images on documents. Here, TMAP lines and objects can be easily removed, producing a very clean end product. We talked a little bit earlier about this idea of decluttering, and this is a great way to remove extraneous information. There are a variety of editors available. Some require a paid subscription or license. Some might be free online with conditions. If this is an option you'd like to try, do your homework and research what fits your needs. The LaserJet printer. I've had very good success with a good quality LaserJet printer. LaserJet toners contain a high amount of carbon, which produces very good quality lines and images on the Swell paper. Copy machine. Use the bypass tray whenever possible if a good quality LaserJet printer is unavailable. This allows non-standard paper to go through the machine in a straight path. Copiers that do not produce very much heat work better. If the copier gets hot, allow the machine to cool down before running more copies. Now, these are just a few ideas. As you use TMAP, you may discover additional methods. We'd love to hear about your experiences, or if you've used TMAPs before, share your thoughts in the comments section. Now, this concludes my portion of today's presentation. And before I introduce my colleague, Sarah, I'd like to open up this time for questions.
Looks like Greg has answered most of them.
Thank you,
But
Greg.
we're seeing questions about using the Swell paper in other than a embosser. Like, can it be used on a copier? Can it be used in a LaserJet printer?
Absolutely. So Swell paper allows ink that has been printed on the Swell paper to raise when it's run through a Swell machine. Okay, so the idea of using the TMAPs and Swell paper would look something like this. Have the TMAP open, available. You can put Swell paper in your LaserJet printer, print that out, adjust or modify as needed, and then run it through the Swell machine, which raises the lines. I hope that makes sense.
And any standards for adding features that we should observe if we're going to add something to the map?
So as far as features is concerned, with the modifications that I've made that tend to work is maybe accentuating a main road or street that I'd like to have my student focus on. So in situations like that, I've done two things. One, I've used a Swell marker and made the line a little bit thicker so that when I run it through the machine, it's a wider line. Alternatively, I've played around with the PDF editor as well, and I've increased and widened the width of the lines. So modifications like that. As a general rule of thumb, the more simple the map, the better for our students. Less clutter, less disorientation, things like that.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have now. So if we're ready to turn it over to Sarah.
Yes, well, thank you, everyone.
Hello, so my name is Sarah McIntyre. I'm an orientation and mobility specialist at LightHouse for the Blind, and today I'm going to talk about two case studies, two students that I worked with using TMAPs, and very successful in both cases, but very different experiences working with the students. So the first student is a congenitally totally blind route traveler. 57 years old, a very, very experienced Braille user, and that becomes important later when we get to the maps that I provided her with. Has a very long history of orientation and mobility training, including independent street crossings and prior use of tactile maps. Again, that was very, very key in the maps that I provided her with. Very, very slow to learn new routes and extremely high levels of anxiety surrounding O&M. Next slide, please. So this student had recently done some work on general spatial development, including learning to use cardinal directions, learning to use active echolocation, understanding relationships between spaces, and kind of that object-to-object relationships that was a very new concept to her, and developing a plan for exploring new spaces on her own. She had made significant improvements in overall spatial awareness, but had really only practiced orienting herself to new spaces with me right there along with her, providing, you know, making sure that everything went well, prompting her. Next slide, please. So this student needs to begin a new job about 30 miles from her home and is set to begin sometime this summer. Her normal commute to the new job site will include multiple forms of transit, including rideshare, Amtrak, and then a 2-block walking route. The 2-block walking route is where the TMAPs came into importance. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, she's been extremely anxious about this transition, and she is having to teach herself this route. I provided her with, you know, everything that we have done on this route has been remote. So I introduced 4 TMAPs to support her. Next slide, please. So this first slide is an overview of the walking route from the Amtrak station to her job site. This map is the one that breaks all of the keep it simple rules that you've just been told. There again, I would not give this to a student who was not already a very, very experienced map reader and a very, very experienced Braille reader. It is very difficult, very cluttered, but I was able to coach her through locating the part that was important. This slide shows on kind of the middle of the page on the right-hand side shows there's a kind of a kidney bean shaped building that is the Amtrak station. It shows the walking route leaving that station and walking straight through to her destination building on kind of middle of the page, left-hand side. Then that was, I was able to, just with kind of simple directions like that, cue her where to go looking for things, and she was able to make perfect sense of this. That said, I would not give this to a student who was not very, very experienced. Next slide, please. So this is a detailed view of the Amtrak station, the surrounding pedestrian paths and nearby buildings that might serve as reference points. These detailed shots were very key to making that bigger cluttered map make sense. So here we have a larger view of the station, and the first part of the pedestrian path, which is where she had a lot of anxiety about leaving the station and which way would she be walking. And there were some other buildings that we use as reference points where she might catch rideshare at some point. So there again, these detailed views are important to making the cluttered map make sense. Next slide, please. So this is a detailed view of the new job site and the pedestrian path that approaches it. So this is, what I had done is the large overview map that was very cluttered. I've broken it down into chunks so that she could see each of those cluttered portions in a less cluttered way. That made a lot of difference. Next slide, please. So this is a simplified overview of the neighborhood surrounding the job site, including streets that might be important if she needed to use rideshare to get to and from work. So she has had kind of difficulty in past experiences with getting rideshare drivers to know where to pick her up, landmarks to give them. So she had asked to just understand kind of some of the surrounding streets. So that was this view. I have removed all the buildings. I did leave the pedestrian paths, but the main feature of this map is the street names, and also still included are the railroad tracks that kind of serve as a reference point to her for where the station is. Next slide, please. So the student used the above 4 TMAPs to identify the overall direction and shape of the route. So when she looked at it, I did not have to point out any of it. She was able to look and go, oh, so basically I'm just walking west. Yep, it's that simple. So where the walking path connects to the Amtrak station, again, she had had a lot of anxiety about getting out of this station. While this didn't tell her the exact path to get from the platform out to the street, it did basically help her understand where in the building it's located, that it was located in the pedestrian path leaving the station is in the northwest corner of the building, and that was very helpful to her. She was able to learn the major streets in the area and to understand the relationship between the job site and a bus stop that a friend had mentioned as a possible commute alternative. So there again, we were able to look at that. In this case, we looked at the that street overview map, and she was able to look at where that bus stop site was. The bus stop is not located on the map, but she had been given the intersection where it was located, and she was able to explore where that is in relationship to her work site and to decide that, yes, that is in fact a possible alternative. Next slide, please. So the lesson set up for using this was we did it completely via Zoom. She had previously been introduced to Zoom and had used it on several prior living skills lessons. So we already had most of the bugs worked out. I definitely would recommend that before you try to do a remote TMAP lesson. Make sure that your student knows the remote setup and is very, very comfortable with it before you try introducing the maps. The student's desk was occupied, so she actually set up a portable TV tray to read on. It was a little bit small, not ideal, but it worked perfectly fine. And she had a tripod that she had used while participating in another online class. So she set up her iPhone on that and was able to move it around until we got a view that met my viewing needs so that I could see her hands and the paper all in one shot. And that actually worked really, really well. Next slide, please. So the results, after having studied the TMAPs on 3 separate lessons, she reported having lowered anxiety about the upcoming transition. And then using a neck-worn phone mount to enable a Zoom lesson while she was traveling, she was able to execute the route multiple times with minimal input from me. So she had done having looked at the TMAP, she was able to look at it and kind of articulate which direction she would need to be walking and what streets she would be crossing, which direction she'd be headed, and then she was able to execute it fairly smoothly. And she now feels that she will be able to travel the route with minimal or no assistance when necessary. Again, for a student who had a lot of anxiety about mobility going into this and had always been shown routes, this is a huge victory for her. Next slide, please. So this second student, again, a totally congenitally blind student with a mild cognitive impairment, 23 years old, currently in a day program, but hoping to transition to a work site soon. The student is a Braille reader. Orientation and mobility had concentrated on street crossing skills, and I was working with her on overall spatial development, which is the reason that I introduced TMAPs. She was working on cardinal directions, mental rotation, and route planning. Next slide, please. So I gave her 2 TMAPs. The first was the area surrounding her day program, and we worked quite a bit with that before I introduced the second map, which was of a destination that she had expressed interest in. So while using the previous map to do a little bit of exploration, we discovered that there was an ice cream shop near her day program that she was interested in. So I provided her with a second map that focused on that ice cream shop, but also included the day program. So on the ice cream shop map, which we're going to look at next, I used a Swell marker to add a symbol that represented the location of her day program. So again, TMAP gives me there's a small round circle that is the destination. In this case was the ice cream shop. But I needed a symbol to let her know where the day program was because I was going to ask her to create a route from her day program to the ice cream shop, which is the map that you see here. Next slide, please. So the challenges I discovered working with this student, while she is a good Braille reader, the ability to just tactily scan and to track lines, extremely disorganized. So scanning around the map, trying to find things, no sense of a plan, and just tracking lines, she would her fingers wouldn't run off the line, come back, no sense of actually just following. So we spent several lessons just doing some tracking practice, and that did help. Next slide, please. So there was improvement with tracking. Still wasn't 100%. I would still have to occasionally remind her, stay on the line. But overall, that it did help. The next lessons that I had hoped to do were practice with organized tactile exploration and continued practice with tracking. Next slide, please. So during indoor lessons, the student used TMAPs to identify which directions each street runs, to identify which streets are parallel to each other and which streets are perpendicular, and identify which side of the street destinations are on, and to articulate a route from her day program to the ice cream shop. All of these did not happen on one lesson, of course, but she was able to articulate a lot of cardinal directions and where things were in relationship to other things. That for her was a major victory. Next slide, please. So during outdoor lessons, she practiced using the TMAP of the program area while walking a route, including holding the map accurately to reflect her current position, and then turning the map every time she made a turn in real life. For a student who was not really aware of when she was turning, that turned out to be a major help to her in her overall spatial skills. Turning the map required her to become aware of, oh, I'm turning. That makes a difference. I have to turn the map. Next slide, please. So last, the student used the TMAP of the ice cream shop's location to articulate a route, and I recorded the route in case she needed a reminder while traveling. She followed the route that she had articulated, and once we got to the ice cream shop, she actually spontaneously planned a new route home back to the day program, and she actually used it to independently recover from a mistake on the return route. She walked a block farther before she turned around and was able to use the map to realize, I did not even have to prompt her to realize, oh, I walked an extra block, so I have to walk an extra block going back. That surprised me. It absolutely thrilled me. So my next plan, had COVID-19 not happened, was to have the student record the route herself using her Braille note. Unfortunately, we did not get to do that, but that was the plan. Next slide, please. So a snapshot of how I use TMAP. So I do use TMAPs to introduce students to new areas. Obviously, that's the most obvious use, but I actually use it to do a lot of spatial development with students, especially now that COVID-19 has hit. Teaching spatial awareness is something that I have found translates really well to remote lessons, and TMAPs are a huge part of that. It's really good for helping students learn how to use cardinal directions and to understand how to mentally rotate things. And then just for overall concept development, I've had some students that have moved to these kind of suburban neighborhoods that are very where all the streets are winding, it's not on a grid. And so providing that in a tactile form, I had a lot of students able to look at it and go, oh, wow, okay, now I understand why I'm having so much trouble. And especially comparing that with a grid area so they can understand why this area is easy for them. And then this is the challenging area, that's why, is because it's not on a grid. So next slide, please. The biggest challenge that I find working with adult students with TMAPs is their attitude. I can't tell you how many students start off going, maps don't make sense to me, I can't read maps. Adult students often will defeat themselves before they begin, and they have to be shown that they can do it. So when a student tells me, oh, maps don't make sense, I can't read maps, that is not to me a deterrent at all. It just means that I have to make the lessons really simple so that they have immediate success and then gradually build complexity once they start getting confident. So next slide, please. The biggest concept challenge that I find is getting students to understand that the lines on the TMAP represent the street. And the way I describe it to students is the lines you see on the TMAP are where the cars drive. If you're walking on that line, you're walking down the street with the cars. The student will actually be walking beside the line, not on the line. That's different than most tactile graphics that they've seen. Most tactile graphics, lines represent borders. And so the street would be between borders or something. And in getting the student to understand that the lines represent the actual street where the cars are, they're walking on either side of that small line. Once students understand that, things usually go fairly smoothly. Next slide, please. So the most important skills to teach to support TMAP use, tracking is a huge one. That is honestly, even for people who are established Braille readers, making sure, independent of Braille, that they are just able to track a line. I have seen a lot of things that you can get away with when reading text that you cannot get away with when tracking a line, especially on a map where the lines are close together. Tracking is a huge one. Scanning, understand cardinal directions is obviously a big one. And that the cardinal directions are really important in getting students to understand how to translate the map on paper into something that's going to be useful in real life. The other thing is having some kind of note-taking system that the student is able to articulate and then record information for hands-free use while traveling, or to make notes on discoveries if they're using TMAP to support exploring. Next slide, please. Okay, that is it, and I am open for questions.
And again, most of them are covered. So I'm thinking maybe we should go ahead and let Steve go next to make sure that he has plenty of time for his presentation.
All right.
Okay, well, hello everyone. This portion of the presentation is a little bit different. The focus here is on the skills and concepts a student would likely need in order to effectively read and interpret the information from a TMAP. The following slides include a sample of materials and activities with accompanying lesson plans that will cover many of the tactile readiness skills that Jennifer and Sarah have mentioned. I know I always appreciate some sort of tangible takeaway when I attend a professional development, so the materials that I'm about to show will be available after the webinar. Let's see, I should also mention that I work at a residential school that serves middle and high school students. So I'm approaching this project through the lens of serving students in that age band and not adults. There are a few prerequisite skills that we would expect most students in this age range to have, things like knowing their left and right, as well as a basic understanding of compass directions. So these activities might not be appropriate for very young students or ones significantly behind in their foundational skills. Similarly, these activities might not be appropriate for adult learners who already have an understanding of basic map reading. So what you're seeing here is an outline of the skills and concepts that we're going to cover. In part one, I've grouped concepts and activities under 3 umbrellas. First, body to object relationships. Before reading a map, one needs to understand themselves as a point of reference and how the objects and locations in their environment are oriented around them. The second umbrella I'm calling map reading skills. This covers some basic tactile graphic literacy. And then finally, we're going to combine those concepts of body to object relationships with map reading skills in order to apply orientation and mobility concepts to a tactile graphic. So this includes things like block orientation, residential grid patterns, and negotiating basic route shapes. The hope here is that once a student works through this sequence, they will be more ready to put their hands on a TMAP and be able to use it in a meaningful way. So then part 2 includes a few brief activities with very simple street maps created with the TMAP system. Next slide. Okay, first umbrella, we're going to target a number of body to object concepts with an activity that comes from an adjunct instructor at Portland State University. And that is creating a tactile representation of a room in the home using magnets and a metal baking sheet. So we're calling this a magnet map. I've got an example up on the slide of a picture of my living room on the right and a map on the left with magnets that represent the couch, the floor tiles in front of a fireplace, pack and play, wardrobe closet, and a baby swing. The first objective here is to just get students to start using their map to make descriptive statements about the room using positional words. In the lesson plans, I've got a series of prompts and questions to get at this, but we're talking simple stuff like the wardrobe closet is next to the baby swing, or if I'm sitting on the couch, the fireplace is to my right. Next slide. So next, we're going to increase the level of complexity. We want to introduce compass directions using these magnet maps. It was impossible to see on the last slide, but there is a tiny silver magnet on the left edge of the baking sheet that indicates north. On this slide, it's highlighted with a red arrow pointing to it. I think it's important to note that north is not facing up the way that this map is oriented. And that's because when I walk into my living room, as seen in the picture on the right, I'm facing to the east. I want my map to be oriented to the direction I'm facing. This is an important point that Sarah mentioned earlier. This is going to become important later. So with compass directions, I want students to describe object locations using cardinal directions. For example, the fireplace is on the east wall, or the couch is south of the closet. Next slide. So then next we're going to combine compass directions with the positional concepts that we worked on first. This is the foundational concept that Sarah mentioned earlier. Can you go ahead and hit play on the video?
I did not share my sound because I did not know there was a video.
Oh, I apologize. I will do my best to describe what was in the video. It's a very low quality video from my phone where I place a figure in the center of the map facing the representation of the fireplace, and then make descriptive statements about where things are in relation to the little figurine. And then what you'll see in the video is me turning the figurine a quarter turn so that it is now facing north. And then I will physically stand up and move my body around to the south side of the map so that I'm facing the same direction as the figurine. The point here is to get students to physically move their body to orient themselves to the map to the direction that they are facing. This is a really important map reading skill if they're going to apply directionality when they're using their maps out on the streets. I guess I'll say a fun extension you could do with these magnet maps, remembering we're thinking about younger age students, or maybe even a place to start with would be to have them design some sort of a treasure hunt for a family member. I've got some other fun ideas of ways that you can apply this activity in the lesson plans. We can go ahead and go to the next slide now. All right, so now we get to using some tactile graphics to start to teach basic map reading skills. This is Umbrella 2. All of the images in the following slides are PDFs that can be made into Tactiles by using a Swell machine or a graphics embosser in the same way as a TMAP. I'm going to show a couple of the graphics and exercises, but there's significantly more in the teaching materials. So the first graphic is just a simple horizontal line that serves as our point of reference. The objective here would be to make sure the student is able to track a line in one direction, identify north and south in relation to the point of reference, and loop back to some of those positional concepts we covered in the magnet maps. For example, you could place a penny north of the line and then determine is the line north or south of the penny. Next slide. So similar concepts here, but adding a layer of complexity by tracking lines in two directions. This graphic is a basic plus with Braille at the top and right points. We can get into positional relationships using all four cardinal directions here. Again, I've got some questions and suggestions for instructions with this graphic in the lesson plans. Next slide. So I keep mentioning these lesson plans. Here's a look at a page from the instructor's guide for a later tactile graphic in the series. This image contains 4 squares at the center of the page, surrounded by 4 lines that intersect at the corners. The objective for this one is to have students track 4 intersecting lines, understand the concept of symbology. So in this case, the squares represent houses and the lines represent roads. And again, we're gradually raising the complexity of the graphics and the complexity of the task. So with this one, we can have students trace a route around the block, identify the streets that they encounter along the way, remembering always that students should orient themselves to the map in the direction that they're facing each time they make a turn. Next slide. Okay, so the skill set for the next set of graphics is tactile discrimination. But within these, we're also going to cover symbology, directionality, and reading a key. Many of the skills already covered will loop back, but be presented in a slightly different way. So this first graphic is just 4 circles in a horizontal line. First, we want to make sure that students can identify shapes on a tactile graphic. And then we can come back to the idea of symbology or representation. So perhaps these 4 circles could represent 4 cities, and we can talk about their position in relationship to one another. Next slide. Okay, next we're introducing multiple shapes. This is a seemingly random placement of a circle, a square, and a triangle. It could be a map of anything. Maybe it's a park with a tree, a bench, and a flower bed. For my purposes, I call this a map of our school commons area, which is a location that all of my students would be familiar with. I would make the couches, the circle couches, the triangle our school office, and the square our main slider door entrance. And then I can start to introduce some movement into the graphic. So I can ask questions like, what direction would you walk to get from the office to the doors? Or if you were standing at the couches, what direction would you walk to get to the office? So you can imagine how these skills could eventually be applied to reading a street map. Okay, next slide. One thing I haven't touched on yet, but is covered in the lesson plans, is teaching students how to orient themselves to a map or a tactile graphic. Another way to think about this is the strategies that would be needed for systematic scanning or searching. This slide contains 3 images we've seen before: the circle, triangle, rectangle, the simple block model with 4 squares, and the plus shape. So I'm going to pause for a second and have you think about this question. Would you use the same scanning or searching technique to orient a student to each of these graphics? Again, that question was, would you use the same scanning or searching techniques in order to orient a student to each of these 3 different graphics?
And to answer the question, if it's yes, put a Y in the chat. If it's no, put an N in the chat.
All right, I'm seeing some N. Good. Hopefully the answer is no, which it looks like we're seeing lots of N's. Or at least hopefully the answer is it depends. In reality, the way that you want to orient a student to each graphic probably depends on your goal for what you want to accomplish with the map or the graphic. So depending on that goal, you might have them do a perimeter search, a scan for a focus point, or just exploring the graphic with both hands. In the lesson plans, there are examples of how to teach a variety of orientation strategies to tactile graphics, but it's, again, another important skill to have for a student to effectively access a TMAP. All right, next slide. So we're moving on to our third umbrella in part one, and this is where students will apply the previous concepts to actual O&M travel situations. So this first graphic is a model of a basic plus intersection. There are all kinds of questions and instructions in the instructor's guide to help students get oriented, apply directional concepts, review traffic patterns, street crossings, and things like that using this graphic. Next slide. Right, we're using this graphic to zoom out a little. Again, this is something I borrowed from an instructor at PSU. We're doing this to review the structure of residential blocks and grid patterns. This is essentially a grid with a couple of the lines removed to create T intersections. You can cover intersection types, address systems, if that's something the student has been introduced to, or concepts of understanding lines that Jennifer and Sarah mentioned before, walking on one side of the line or the other. Also problem solving. Say the student needs to get from the left-hand margin to the right-hand margin, but runs into a T intersection. Can they reroute and get back to the original street? Next slide. Okay, which leads to the idea of route patterns. So that can be easily reviewed with this same graphic. I've drawn a basic L and a basic Z route shape on this graphic. An easy activity would be to place 2 coins on the grid and have the students design a route from one coin to the next. And that does it for the prerequisite skills section. So part 2 is only 3 slides and we'll go very quickly. Some ideas for introducing actual TMAPs to students. The first map is probably more complex than where you typically want to start. This is a map of the Washington State School for the Blind campus where I work when I ran it through TMAP. I put it here in the sequence just because for my purposes, it's motivating for our students to read a map of a familiar place. Especially in our current setting where they've been away from school for 6 months. So some fun ways that I might play around with a TMAP would be to have a student create a social story about a day in the life of a student at school and use the map to tell the story, moving from one location to another. Next slide. So now we've finally arrived at an actual street map. This is a TMAP for an address in a neighborhood with a simple grid pattern. With this scale of a map, I believe this is a 1 to 200 level. A student can identify the 4 streets surrounding their block and preview the walking route around a block. Remembering, of course, to orient the map to the direction they're facing each time they change their direction. If they are sitting at a table previewing this route, I would recommend actually getting up and moving their body as if they were making the turns while the map stays stationary on the table. If the student takes the map out with them on a walk around their block, then of course they would turn the map in their hands each time they change directions, and this would take a lot of practice. But even with our current shelter-in-place recommendations, this is an activity that many students can go out and do with a family member, acknowledging, of course, that not all students live in residential neighborhoods with clean square blocks. But for this presentation, I wanted to stick with kind of a simple example. Okay, next slide. And finally, this is the same address zoomed out to the 1 to 400 level. At this point, if a student gets to this level of complexity with map reading, they're probably ready for longer walking routes and really getting the big picture orientation of a neighborhood. At this point, we've returned to the type of instruction and travel that Jennifer and Sarah discussed earlier. And so we've progressed from a single line on a sheet of paper all the way back to a regular TMAP. One final thought before I close. I think under normal circumstances, most O&M instructors probably aren't going to want to sit down inside a room and spend a great deal of time at a table working through a sequence of tactile graphics. But we're all trying to kind of figure out meaningful ways to provide service during a pandemic. And my hope is that this is something that we can do from a distance or when community travel is not possible, and lay the foundation for using TMAPs as a tool more effectively when we're able to get back to that traditional face-to-face orientation and mobility instruction. So now that we've returned to the point where we started, that's it for my portion, and I can take questions.
There's a question about using purchase orders to order TMAPs.
I will defer to Greg.
And
Should
Go
I
ahead,
dive in? I actually don't have a good answer for that. I don't believe that TMAPs themselves, meaning if you were to order through adaptations.org, they are not a quota item for Department of Education at this time.
there's a question about using a PDF editor to edit the TMAP before you emboss it.
I saw that. Yes, in theory, just about any editor that can edit PDFs will work to greater or lesser degrees. In our shop, our default is Adobe Illustrator. I'm not familiar with the one that was listed in the chat. I know that Sarah and Jennifer, what have you been using that has been easy to work with?
Jen has done more work with the PDF editors, and I don't know which one she was using.
What are you using for your designs when you create from scratch?
When I create from scratch, I'm using Inkscape.
Okay.
That said, Inkscape is a complex program, and I actually have not been able to use it too. I know we get with the TMAP files, we get the SVG. I have not gotten them to open the SVG file. I don't know why. So I actually have not had a lot of success using it with Inkscape.
Okay.
The question about the purchase orders is not using quota funds, but actually asking for the product, getting the product sent, and then getting paid.
I will have to follow up with the adaptations staff to see how they handle that. And of course, you could contact adaptations directly and ask them. But yeah, I'm not really intimately familiar with the retail side of the operation.
And let's take one more. Steve, can you talk a little bit about the symbols that you use on the maps, the tactile symbols, and how you make determinations as to which ones to use?
Yeah, not everything that's in the sequence of graphics that I created was in this presentation, but I start with kind of a wide variety of symbols, and so that students build that understanding that anything can be a symbol. And for example, a circle might be a city on one map, it might be a house on another map, and it might be a chair if you're looking at a interior of a room map. So we want to make sure that students understand that symbols are just that and can change, and you need to know the purpose for a specific graphic. But as it gets farther along in the sequence, I tried to use symbols that specifically match those in TMAP. And there is an activity around practicing reading a TMAP key so that students are becoming familiar with the symbols used in that platform and applying them to reading graphics. I hope that makes sense.
All right, thank you. So if we didn't get to your question, we are obviously going to take down the chat and make sure those questions get distributed and get answered as best we can. So we are reaching the end. Do we have time to wrap up, or do we need to close out, Leanne?
You got 2 minutes. You can do it fast.
Well, then I will quickly show you my last slide. Oh, I think I muted myself.
You haven't. I can hear you.
All right. All right, final slide. One last APH product I want to mention here to you is the Sunu Band. It has several features. It is a sonar smartwatch, so you basically get haptic feedback on the time. Object detection, 16 feet away outdoors, 8 feet away indoors, and you can customize those things. It has an app that goes along with it that does some other things. It's a $299 product that we sell. Get information at all those places we mentioned before, the sales email, customer service, and just aph.org. And that's going to wrap my slides up.
It does. I want to say thank you all. I learned wonderful ways to include maps into working with students and adults, especially at times when we cannot work with them hand in hand. So thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing more about what all of our participants do with your TMAPs.